The day my father accidentally opened the wrong envelope, my entire family learned I was making about $40,000 a month. The crazy part wasn't the money. It was how fast love, respect, and expectations suddenly changed the moment they thought I could solve everyone's problems. For years they believed I was barely getting by. I let them believe it. Looking back, that decision protected my peace for a long time. Then, one envelope changed everything. I'm Olivia. I'm 28. And if you met me in person, you probably wouldn't think twice about me. I drive a 7-year-old Honda Civic. I rent a comfortable but ordinary apartment outside Columbus, Ohio. Most days I wear jeans, sneakers, and plain t-shirts I buy on sale. I don't wear designer handbags. I don't own expensive jewelry. My phone is 3 years old because it still works. Nothing about my life looks impressive. That has always been intentional. What almost nobody knows is that I own an online software company that started as a side project while I was in college. It grew slowly, painfully slowly. For 3 years I barely made enough to cover my hosting bills. Then, something changed. One product went viral. Then another. Companies started licensing my software. I hired contractors. Then employees. Eventually, I stopped counting every dollar, because the business was earning more in 1 month than I'd made in an entire year at my old office job. After taxes, payroll, and business expenses, my personal income averaged around $40,000 every month. Sometimes more, sometimes a little less. Enough that money stopped being my biggest worry. But I never changed the way I lived. Not because I was afraid to enjoy my success, because I knew my family. My parents are good people. I still believe that. But like a lot of families, they had a favorite child even if they'd never admit it. My older brother, Ethan. He's 32. Growing up, Ethan was always described as full of potential. If he got a C in school, my parents said he was distracted because he was so creative. If I got an A-, they asked why it wasn't an A. When Ethan quit his first job after 6 months, Dad said he was finding himself. When I stayed at the same company for 4 years before leaving to build my business, Mom worried I wasn't ambitious enough. It wasn't cruel. It was just constant death by 1,000 tiny comparisons. Every Sunday we had dinner together. Every single Sunday, Mom cooked. Dad grilled something. Ethan usually arrived 20 minutes late. His wife had divorced him 2 years earlier, and he blamed everything except himself. Traffic, the economy, bad business partners, terrible luck. Everyone except Ethan was responsible for Ethan's problems. Dad always defended him. He's trying. Mom would nod. He'll figure it out. Then someone would eventually ask me how work was going. What are you doing these days again? Ethan would ask, even though I'd explained it dozens of times. I run software subscriptions. So, computers. Basically. He'd laugh. I still don't understand how people make money on the internet. Neither did my parents. Which worked out perfectly for me. Dad usually smiled politely. As long as you're paying your bills. I am. Mom always added the same sentence. Maybe someday you'll find something with better benefits. I'd smile. Maybe. Meanwhile, I'd spent that morning approving payroll for 11 employees. People always ask why I didn't just tell them. The answer is simple. Because I'd seen what happened whenever anyone in the family had money. Money stopped belonging to the person who earned it. It became a family resource. When Grandpa sold his farm years earlier, relatives came out of nowhere asking for small loans. When my aunt inherited money from her mother, everyone suddenly had emergencies. I've watched that cycle my entire life. I wanted no part of it. I still helped. Just quietly. When Dad's furnace failed during one winter, an anonymous payment appeared on the contractor's invoice before he could finance it. He thought there had been a billing mistake. There hadn't. When Mom needed dental work that insurance didn't fully cover, I mailed a cashier's check anonymously through her dentist's office. She spent weeks trying to figure out who'd done it. I never told her. Sometimes helping anonymously feels more honest than helping while expecting gratitude. Then there was Ethan. If you ask my parents, Ethan was a businessman. If you asked his bank account, he was a professional optimist. He'd started 6 businesses in 10 years. A landscaping company, an online clothing store, a food truck, a cryptocurrency consulting service, a home renovation business, a coffee subscription company. Every one of them failed. Not because success was impossible, because Ethan loved starting businesses. He hated running them. The moment something became difficult, he moved on to another, life-changing opportunity. Dad invested money almost every time. Mom quietly emptied savings more than once. Whenever I suggested maybe Ethan needed stability, instead of another risky venture, I became the negative sister. Support your brother. He just needs one break. He believes in himself. I wanted to ask why believing in yourself mattered more than actually finishing something. I never did. One Sunday after dinner, Dad mentioned helping Ethan again. He found a warehouse space. I nodded. That's nice. He just needs a little capital. How much? Dad hesitated. About $25,000. I nearly dropped my fork. Ethan doesn't have $25,000. No. So where is it coming from? Dad smiled. We'll figure something out. Translation? They'd take out another loan. I wanted to scream. Instead, I quietly asked, has he written a business plan? Dad frowned. You always ask questions. Because they're important. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Not everything has to be analyzed, Liv. Actually, businesses usually do. I let it go. Like always. Despite everything, I loved my parents. They never asked me for money, because they genuinely believed I didn't have any. Ironically, that misunderstanding kept our relationship healthy. I was simply Olivia, not Olivia the bank account. My business kept growing. I hired a financial advisor, an accountant. Eventually they insisted I separate everything. Business accounts, investment accounts, personal income, retirement, insurance. The amount of paperwork became ridiculous. Most statements were digital. Occasionally, something still arrived by mail. Normally, it went directly to my apartment. Normally, one Friday afternoon, Mom called. Sweetheart? Hey. Your mail came here by mistake. Again. It happens. Dad had the same first initial and last name. Sometimes envelopes got mixed up between our addresses after I'd temporarily used theirs years earlier. I'll pick it up Sunday. No rush. I didn't think anything of it. Because nothing like this had ever happened before. Sunday dinner felt normal. Mom made roast chicken. Dad talked about baseball. Ethan spent 20 minutes explaining why his latest business idea was different. I smiled politely. Inside, I was exhausted. When dinner ended, Mom handed me a small stack of envelopes. These came for you. I looked through them. Insurance, bank advertisement, property tax notice. One envelope was missing. I frowned. Wasn't there another one? Dad looked up. I think there was. What did it look like? White. I laughed. That's helpful. He shrugged. I probably said it somewhere. We looked around the kitchen. Nothing. Mom checked the counter. Nothing. It's probably mixed with my paperwork. Dad walked toward his home office. I'll look. Something cold settled in my stomach. There was only one envelope I really hoped hadn't been opened. The monthly income summary. Before quarterly meetings. Plain white envelope. No obvious company logo. Very official looking. My heartbeat sped up. Dad disappeared into the office. A minute passed. Then another. Silence. Too much silence. Finally, I heard him say my name. Not loudly. Not angrily. Just confused. Olivia. I walked toward the doorway. He was sitting at his desk. One envelope lay open beside him. Several neatly printed pages were spread across the desk. His reading glasses had slipped halfway down his nose. He looked at the papers. Then at me. Then back again. He swallowed. Is. He lifted one page. Is this yours? Every instinct told me to lie. Instead, I quietly answered, yes. He stared at the number highlighted near the top of the page. Average monthly distributions, $40,218.37. His face lost all color. You. He looked genuinely unable to process what he was seeing. You make. He stopped. Started again. Every month? The room became impossibly quiet. I slowly nodded. Neither of us spoke. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Mom. Then Ethan. What happened? Mom asked. Dad didn't answer. He just kept staring at the statement in his hands. Then, without taking his eyes off me, he said words that made my stomach drop. I think. He swallowed hard. Everyone needs to see this. Dad held the statement in both hands, like it might disappear if he blinked. Mom stepped closer first. What is it? He silently handed her the first page. She adjusted her glasses. Her eyes moved across the numbers once. Then again, she frowned. I don't understand. What? She looked at the monthly income summary one more time before looking at me. Olivia. Her voice barely came out. Is this saying what I think it is? I nodded. Yes. Ethan laughed. No way! He reached for the papers before anyone stopped him. The smile disappeared from his face almost instantly. What the? He flipped to another page. Then another. No. He looked directly at me. You're telling me you've been making this kind of money? I wasn't telling anyone. For how long? A little over 3 years. Nobody spoke. I could actually hear the clock on the kitchen wall. Tick, tick, tick. Dad slowly sat down. I thought. He rubbed his forehead. I thought you were barely paying rent. I let you think that. Mom looked genuinely hurt. But why? I answered honestly. Because I knew this moment would happen. She frowned. What moment? I looked around the room. The moment when everyone stopped seeing me and started seeing my bank account. Nobody argued. Not because they agreed. Because it was already happening. Dinner was over, but nobody left. Instead, everyone sat around the table asking questions. What exactly do you do? How did this happen? Why didn't you tell us? How much is the business worth? Questions I'd never heard before. Not once in the years they believed I was struggling had anyone asked how my work actually functioned. Now they wanted every detail. I answered only what I felt comfortable sharing. I build software. For businesses. We sell subscriptions. Dad shook his head. I had no idea. I know. He looked embarrassed. I never really asked. No? You didn't. On the drive home, I kept replaying the evening. Nobody had yelled. Nobody demanded money. Not yet. But something had changed. I could feel it. It was subtle. Like the air before a thunderstorm. The next morning, Mom called. That alone was unusual. She normally texted. Good morning, sweetheart. Morning? I've been thinking. I figured. I wish you would have trusted us. I wanted to. But I wanted you to love me for me. She became quiet. We do. I hope so. 3 days later, Dad invited me to lunch. We hadn't had lunch together alone in years. He spent the first 20 minutes asking about my company. Real questions. The kind he'd never asked before. Part of me appreciated the interest. Another part wondered why it had taken a financial statement to make him curious about my life. As we stood outside the restaurant, he hesitated. I've been proud of you for a long time. I smiled sadly. I wish I'd known that before last Sunday. He didn't have an answer. Then Ethan called. Hey, Liv. He sounded unusually cheerful. What do you need? He laughed. You always assume the worst. I know you. Fair? He got quiet. I've got an opportunity. Of course he did. I figured. This one's different. They always are. He ignored that. I only need a little help. How much? There was a pause. 100,000. I actually thought I'd misheard him. I'm sorry? It isn't really an expense. It's an investment. No. You haven't even heard. No. You don't know the business. No. Silence. Finally he asked, "Is that because you don't trust me?" I answered before thinking, "Yes." Another silence. Then he hung up. 2 hours later, Mom called. "You hurt your brother." I told him no. He said, "You didn't even listen." I've listened to 6 businesses already. This one's different. So were the other 6. Mom sighed. Family helps family. There it is. What? I've been waiting for someone to say it. She sounded confused. What's wrong with helping your brother? Nothing. If it's voluntary. This doesn't feel voluntary. It isn't like that. It already is. Over the next month, something strange happened. People I barely knew started contacting me. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in 4 years suddenly wanted lunch. An uncle asked for career advice. Family group chats became unusually active. Everyone suddenly remembered I existed. It wasn't cruel. It was uncomfortable. Every conversation eventually drifted toward money. Investments. Businesses. Loans. Opportunities. I started saying no more often. Every no seemed to disappoint someone. Dad tried to stay neutral. At least at first. Then one Sunday after dinner, he asked if I could stay behind. Mom quietly collected plates. Ethan remained seated. That immediately told me this wasn't going to be a private conversation. Dad folded his hands. Ethan deserves another chance. I closed my eyes briefly. Dad. He has a detailed proposal. I'm sure he does. He only needs one investor. I'm not investing. It doesn't have to be viewed as investing. What should I call giving someone $100,000? Dad looked uncomfortable. A loan. I looked at Ethan. Would you qualify for a bank loan? No. Why? The banks don't understand. I almost laughed. No. They understand risk. Ethan leaned forward. So you think I'm a risk? I think your history answers that. His face hardened. You've changed. No. You have. I started noticing smaller things too. Mom insisted on paying for coffee one afternoon. When I reached for my wallet, she actually smiled. You've paid enough. It sounded kind. It also sounded different. Before, she'd insist because she believed I needed the money. Now she insisted because she believed I didn't. The action was identical. The reason wasn't. That difference bothered me more than I expected. A few weeks later, I attended a neighborhood fundraiser. Halfway through the evening, one of Dad's longtime friends introduced himself to a couple beside us. This is Olivia. Then he laughed. You know, Ethan's little sister. The woman smiled. Oh! I've heard about you. Something about her expression felt odd. What have you heard? She answered without realizing she'd just changed everything. That you've had a hard time finding your footing. I frowned. She continued. Ethan always says you're still trying to figure life out. My stomach dropped. He says you're working little jobs here and there until something works out. I stared at her. I'm sorry. Hey, who told you that? Ethan, she smiled innocently. He talks about wanting to help you get back on your feet. The room suddenly felt much smaller. I forced a smile. We should probably talk another time. I walked outside before anyone noticed the expression on my face. For several minutes, I just stood beside my car. Trying to breathe. Trying to make sense of what I just heard. Had Ethan really spent years telling people I was struggling? Why? To protect my privacy? No. He didn't know the truth. Which meant he'd invented it. I started paying attention. More conversations surfaced. An old family friend apologized for everything I'd been through. Someone else congratulated me on finally doing better. I asked gentle questions. Piece by piece. The picture came together. Ethan had built an entire narrative. Poor Olivia. couldn't keep a career, always needed help, still finding herself. Meanwhile, he was the ambitious entrepreneur, the successful son, the one carrying the family's reputation. None of it was true. But nobody had questioned him. Why would they? Even our parents had unknowingly reinforced the image. I didn't confront him immediately. I wanted to know why. Then the answer came unexpectedly. Dad called one evening. "Can you stop by tomorrow?" "Sure." When I arrived, Dad was in the garage, sorting old boxes. "I found these." Inside one box were old Christmas cards, birthday invitations, family newsletters. Then I noticed something. A newspaper clipping. It featured Ethan receiving a local Young Entrepreneur Award years earlier. Across the bottom, someone had handwritten, "Our successful son." Mom recognized the handwriting immediately. It was hers. She covered her mouth. "I forgot I wrote that." I looked through more keepsakes. Almost every milestone centered around Ethan. Business articles, certificates, photos. My accomplishments were there too. Graduation, scholarships, awards. But they were tucked underneath everything else. Not intentionally, just symbolically. Mom sat down. "I never realized." Dad looked devastated. "We did this." Neither of them meant to. That somehow made it sadder. The following Sunday, I asked Ethan to meet me before dinner. Just us. He arrived confident. "What's up?" I looked at him. "I met one of Dad's friends." "So?" "They told me you've been telling people I'm broke." His smile disappeared. "I never said broke. What word would you prefer?" I simplified things. "You lied." "I protected the family image." I stared at him. "My image?" "No. Mine." At least he was honest. He sighed. "You were always the smart one." "What does that mean?" "If people thought you were doing better than me." Then, what was I? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So, you made me look like a failure." "It wasn't like that." "It was exactly like that. I just—" He looked away. "I needed one thing that was mine." I almost laughed. "You needed to steal my reputation." It wasn't stealing. It absolutely was. Dinner that night was quiet. Until Dad asked, "Did you two work things out?" I answered calmly. "Ethan admitted he's been lying about me." Mom looked confused. "What?" Ethan immediately became defensive. "It wasn't lying." Dad frowned. "What did you tell people?" Ethan hesitated, then admitted enough. Not everything, but enough. Dad's face slowly changed. Disappointment, confusion, embarrassment. "You let people think your sister couldn't support herself." I didn't think it mattered. I finally spoke. It mattered. Because while everyone believed I was struggling, you got to be the success story. Nobody said anything. I looked around the table, then at my parents. "I need you both to hear something." They nodded. I took a deep breath. "You didn't start treating me differently when you learned who I was. You started treating me differently when you learned what I earned." Mom immediately shook her head. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" I looked at Dad. "When was the last time you asked about my company before the envelope?" He couldn't answer. I looked at Mom. "When was the last time you wanted to have lunch just to hear about my work?" Silence. Then I turned to Ethan. "You spent years making yourself look successful by making me look unsuccessful." He looked down. Finally, I said the words I'd been carrying for weeks. "You didn't love me when you thought I was broke." I paused. "You loved the number when you found out I wasn't." Mom started crying. Dad looked like someone had taken the air out of him. Ethan couldn't meet my eyes. I stood. "I'm not cutting anyone out of my life." 3 surprised faces looked back at me. "But things are changing." I looked at Ethan. "I will never finance your businesses." He nodded quietly. "I understand." I looked at my parents. "I'll always help when there's a genuine emergency. But I decide what that help looks like. No loans." No investments. No guilt. Dad slowly nodded. That's fair. And if we're going to have a relationship, it has to be because you want your daughter. Not because you know my income. Mom stood up and hugged me. This time, it felt different, not perfect. Honest. Things didn't magically heal. Trust rarely does. It rebuilds one conversation at a time. Dad eventually apologized for opening the envelope, even though it had been an accident. More importantly, he apologized for talking to everyone before talking to me. Mom stopped asking about money altogether. Instead, she started asking about books I'd read, places I'd visited, whether I was happy, questions I wished she'd asked years earlier. Ethan sold his latest business idea before it ever launched. A year later he got a steady operations job with a manufacturing company. For the first time in his adult life, he stayed. We aren't especially close, but we're honest. That's a better foundation than we ever had before. As for me, I still drive the same Honda. I still wear jeans. Most people still assume I'm doing okay, but nothing extraordinary. And that's exactly how I like it. Because I learned something from all of this. Money doesn't reveal who you are. It reveals how other people see you. Sometimes that's painful. Sometimes it's freeing. For me, it was both.